And one of the things Nietzsche predicted at the end of the 19th century was that there were going to be two major consequences of the collapse of formal religious belief. He believed that that would lead people to a morally relativistic condition that would prove psychologically intolerable. Because if you adopt a morally relativist position and you take it to its final conclusion, then everything is of equal value and there's no gradient between things. There's no better and there's no worse. And in the final analysis you might say, well, there's no good and there's no evil. And the problem with that is you can't actually orient yourself in a world that has those properties, because in order to act, as we've already talked about with regards to the cybernetic models, you have to be aiming at something that's better than what you have now, or there's no reason to expend the energy. And so you need the gradient, you need a value differentiation in order to act. And Nietzsche's analysis was predicated on the idea that if the value hierarchy collapsed, well, not only would people not be motivated to do anything anymore, but they would also be extraordinarily confused and depressed, because the value would go out of their life, and the consequence of that would be that they would become somewhat nihilistic, or maybe absolutely nihilistic, or that they would turn to ideological, rigid ideological systems as a replacement. Now, what Nietzsche offered as an alternative to that was that human beings could create their own values. And so his idea was that the superman, the overman, depending on how you look at it, would be the person who was capable of transcending the valueless universe that the decline of religion had left with us, and creating their own values as a conscious act. The problem with that is that it isn't obvious that you can create your own values as a conscious act, because it's not obvious that values are consciously created. And I think this is why the psychoanalysts had so much to add to the philosophical debate, at least the philosophical debate that developed to the point of Nietzsche's observations. When Freud entered the scene, the idea of the unconscious was in the air, but Freud formalized it to a much greater degree than anyone else had. And Freud's theory really is deeply biological. You know, it's biological, it's social as well, but his proposition, the proposition that there's an id, is fundamentally the proposition that you're not necessarily, your consciousness, for sure, is not the master in its own house. Now, I think part of the reason that people like to go after Freud, there's a variety of reasons, but one of them is that modern people basically accept radical Freudian presuppositions more or less as givens now. You know, and so if you're a brilliant thinker and your thought permeates a society to the point where your most radical propositions are accepted by everyone, all that's really left are your errors. And so it's easy to concentrate on Freud's errors because we've already digested everything he had to say that was particularly profound. I mean, I don't imagine, perhaps I'm wrong, but I don't imagine that there's anyone in this room to whom the news that many of your motivations aren't conscious comes as a surprise. I mean, even psychologists have admitted that in the last 20 years, you know. I mean, they talk about the cognitive unconscious, which I think is a real sleight of hand maneuver to stop them from having to credit Freud with his discoveries. And I also think that Freud's notion of the unconscious is far more sophisticated than the cognitive scientists' notion, because Freud viewed the unconscious as a place that was basically populated by fragmented personalities, not cognitive schemes of one form or another, and not processes, but things that were like living beings. And you know, you think, well, are there living beings in your unconscious? And the answer to that is, well, are you alive or not? And you're alive, so you're composed of living subcomponents, and they're not machines, or at least not in any way that we understand machines. They're fragmentary subpersonalities, and each of them have their own worldview and rationalizations and emotional structure and goals. And so that's why when you get hungry, you see the world through the eyes of a hungry person, and you think thoughts about food, and your emotional reactions depend on whether food is available or whether it isn't, and maybe whether or not the food you want is available and whether it isn't. And you know, that's nature, so to speak, imposing its necessities on you as a living being. And for Freud, that was the id. And Freud thought of the id really as something that was primordial and primitive. And that's one of the things that really separated him from Jung. And I think Jung is much more accurate from the perspective of evolutionary psychology. In fact, I think he's radically underestimated as a thinker whose thought was unbelievably deeply grounded in biology. And like, Jung was a remarkable person because his notion of history and the relationship between history and the human psyche covered spans of time that were really, until modern historians and evolutionary psychologists started to talk about deep time and the fact that, you know, the entire 4 billion year history of the world is in some sense relevant to us as beings, or at least the 3.5 billion year history that there's been life on the planet. Ancient history for European philosophers was like 500 to 2,000 years ago. And Jung thought way past that, way back farther than that, and started to take into serious account the fact that the origins of our psyche, the ground of our psyche, is deeply biological, and that it's an emergent property. So for Freud's idea of the unconscious is somewhat difficult to understand because there's sort of two elements to it. There's the id, which is the source of primordial motivation. And Freud concentrated mostly on aggression and sexuality. And the reason he concentrated on those two, although he concentrated on what he called the death instinct later in his life, the reason he concentrated on those two primarily wasn't because he regarded them necessarily as the most compelling of motivations, but he regarded those motivations as the ones that were most difficult for most people to integrate successfully into the social world. So he thought that they were most likely to be repressed and therefore underdeveloped and immature. And I think that's a reasonable proposition. I think that modern people would have to add eating to that, because since the time of Freud we've gone, I would say, from a high proportion of sexually related pathologies to a very, very high proportion of eating related pathologies, but that's in some sense beside the point. So that's one part of the Freudian unconscious, sort of an implicit unconscious. And then the other part of the Freudian unconscious is those things that have happened to you that you've repressed because you don't like what they imply. And you know, those are very different kinds of unconscious, because one of them is dependent on your experience and the other isn't. And you could think of Jung actually as a deep archaeologist of the id. And Freud thought about the id in sort of primordial terms. So his angry id would be, you know, like a beast that's out of control. But Jung recognized that the unconscious was far more sophisticated in many ways than the conscious parts of your being, and that it guided your adaptation in ways that you didn't understand, and that the ways in which it guided your adaptation and structured your understanding were universal, hence biological, and far more sophisticated than a somewhat primordial notion of biological drive might indicate. So one of the things that you might consider, for example, is that from the Jungian perspective, a lot of the forces that ancient people considered deities were personified representations of instinctual systems. So here's a way of thinking about it, and this is a way of thinking about the collective unconscious, which is Jung's, in some sense, Jung's replacement term for the Freudian id. So Mars, for example, is the god of war, Roman god of war. And you might say, well, what does it mean for there to be a god of war? And the answer, or Venus is the god of love, actually of sexual attraction more particularly. Or of sexual possession, which is even a better way of thinking about it. And you say, well, why would people conceptualize of those phenomena as gods? The Greeks said, for example, that human beings were the playthings of the gods. No, that was Shakespeare. I'm sorry, that was Shakespeare who said that. Well, here's one way of thinking about it. What's older, you or aggression? And the answer to that is, well, you're 23. And the system that mediates biological aggression in mammals and their progenitors is tens of millions of years old. And if you think you control it rather than the other way around, you're deluded about your central nature. Part of it is that you don't control it at all. What happens is that you never go anywhere where you need to use it. And so one of the things that happens to soldiers in wartime, for example, is they go somewhere where they could use it, and out it comes, and the consequence of its emergence is so traumatic that they develop post-traumatic stress disorder, because they observe themselves doing things that are hyper-aggressive that they could have never imagined that someone like them could have manifested. And then you think, well, what about Venus as a goddess? Well, if you fall in love with someone, who is that a choice? It doesn't look like a choice. I mean, if it's a choice, it's often an incredibly self-destructive and idiotic choice, and it's often one that ruins people's entire lives. It's more like a state of possession. And then you might say, well, possession by what? Well, it's a dynamic living system. And it's also immortal in some sense, which is another reason why conceptualizing it as a deity makes sense. I mean, the phenomena of love, which is the manifestation of a complex biological system, will be around long after you're gone, and was there long before you showed up. And when it manifests itself, so to speak, within you, you're possessed by it, and you do its bidding. And you may do its bidding despite what you most deeply want.